Sonic, the heart of your system.
Alright guys, Dominic here for KitGuru, and this laptop beside me is the ASUS ROG Zephyrus G GA502. So this is actually the machine I got to preview back in April in New York when ASUS announced its kind of latest lineup of laptops, and now I've been using it for the past week in order to bring you my full review. So just as a quick recap as to kind of what made this laptop so interesting for me, it's kind of the fact that it cost £1,249, so as laptops go, it's kind of one of the more entry-level or affordable gaming laptops. Yet despite that, it is still very much an ASUS Zephyrus machine, so that means it's kind of got the more premium styling, it's kind of thin and light, very attractive, very sleek, but still at that more affordable price. On top of that, it still has some decent hardware inside. It's got one of the new Ryzen 7 3750H mobile processors, and that's a quad-core unit. And there's also a GTX 1660 Ti Max-Q graphics. Alongside that, we have 16GB of DDR4 2400MHz memory, as well as a 512GB NVMe SSD. We're going to kick off this review with a look at the design though, and like I said, this is very much a Zephyrus laptop despite the lower price tag. So what that means is you get a very kind of premium looking, overall sleek and stylish design, and that starts with the brushed metal lid. It's kind of got this two-tone brush look which looks really nice, and there's also the ASUS ROG logo on the back which kind of glows this kind of subtle red colour. It's not very bright, so it's not too kind of in your face, but you can also turn that off if you want. Part of the appeal of the Zephyrus family as well is that they're all quite thin, they're all quite portable, where other laptops around this price point might be a bit thicker, this chassis actually measures just 19.9mm thick. That being said, there are some rubber feet at the bottom, so if you measure from the desk, the total thickness is closer to 25mm, but even so, it is very thin. On top of that, this laptop weighed in at just under 2.1 kilograms on my scales, so again, not very heavy whatsoever. Easy to stick in a backpack and carry around. So despite the fact that the laptop is quite thin and quite light, it is also reassuringly well built. We already mentioned the metal lid, which feels really good, and there's only some slight small flex when you try and apply pressure to the screen. And then while the inside of the machine is made from plastic, so the only metal is on the lid, it still feels quite nice and sturdy. I was trying to apply some pressure to kind of the keyboard area, and again, there was only some minimal flexing. So overall, for the price, I think it is a very attractively designed laptop, and it also feels pretty well built. Now, this slim design also extends to the screen, where we can see particularly thin bezels around the top and sides. ASUS actually claims these measure just 6.2mm, and that gives a total screen to body ratio of 81%. So again, very minimal on the bezels. That being said, that does come at the cost of the webcam. You'll notice there's actually no webcam whatsoever, either at the top or on the bottom as like one of those chin cams, and you don't get an external webcam in the box. This is obviously going to depend on your priority, so if you use a webcam a lot, that might stop and make you think, but for me personally, and I would expect probably for most gamers, the lack of a webcam really isn't a big deal. As for the screen itself, it is a 15.6-inch 1080p panel using the AHVA IPS technology, but the main thing that's going to appeal to gamers is its 120Hz refresh rate. That being said, I do have to say the screen is definitely the biggest drawback for the Zephyrus G. It may be fast and you definitely get a smooth gaming experience thanks to the 120Hz refresh rate, but overall the colours are just a bit of a letdown. It doesn't look very vibrant, and it's also relatively dim. We actually measured a peak brightness of 255 nits, and that was with the screen at 100% brightness. In terms of colour, we saw 68% sRGB gamut coverage, as well as just 51% of Adobe RGB coverage. So kind of, it is a fairly major negative point for the Zephyrus G, the fact that the colours don't look that good. So I would just say, if you are kind of the person who wants to do a bit more than just play games, because I think if you are just gaming, you can kind of get away with it. It doesn't look as good, but you know, still fine, still 120Hz. But if you do want to do a bit more kind of photo editing or anything where colours are important, even just watching movies, it's not the best with a relatively dull looking screen like this one. So definitely the biggest drawback for the Zephyrus G. Moving on now to the keyboard, this has a white only backlight, so no RGB here. And I think generally it is okay to type with. The action is reasonably satisfying. There's a little bit of tactile feedback there, even if travel distance isn't that long, especially, well, I guess it's to be expected because it is such a thin laptop. The biggest problem for me though with the keyboard was simply the fact that the layout is a bit strange. So the main thing here for me is the fact that we've got a half height enter key, and this is, I confirm this is actually the UK model, so even the UK model has the half height enter key, and I'm sure any UK person watching this will be used to the ISO layout where we've got our double height enter key, so it's just a lot of muscle memory to overcome. It's not the end of the world, but I think if ASUS ROG could have just spaced the keyboard out a bit more and given us that double height enter key, it would have been a bit better. Similar things can also be said about the trackpad. It's not bad at all. I found that the general scrolling and kind of multi-finger gestures experience was absolutely fine. I had no issues there, but the clicks are quite spongy. So I can appreciate you're not really going to be using the trackpad that much if you're a gamer. You're obviously going to have a dedicated external mouse, but considering the thin and light nature of this machine, if you're just taking it out to a coffee shop to send some emails or whatever you're doing, I think a slightly better trackpad would have been appreciated. Moving on now to look at I/O. So on the right hand side of the laptop we have two USB 3.1 Gen 1 Type A ports, and on the left hand side of the laptop there is another of these Gen 1 Type A ports, as well as a USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type C, which also carries DisplayPort output. Next to that there is a audio jack, and we also have HDMI output, as well as a full-size Ethernet, which is, I think, a particularly good inclusion, both because this is a cheaper model and it seems gaming laptops are kind of getting rid of Ethernet more and more, so having that option is definitely appreciated. As for the internals of the laptop, the underside panel is held on with 15 screws, and once they come out you can kind of unpop the panel and then we get a look at the motherboard. The first thing to note is the fact that there's actually no 2.5-inch drive bays, so no option for any 2.5-inch hard drives or anything like that. But one consequence of that is that we have a relatively large battery which is rated at 76 watt hours. Above that and to the left we have an M.2 slot you can see is occupied. It is occupied by a 512GB Intel 660p SSD, which by default comes in this kind of little external casing. So it's not the biggest drive, it's the only drive in the system, but I think at this price point I would rather have a slightly smaller SSD for those increased speeds, and it is still big enough for Windows and then several games. If you do want to add some extra storage though, ASUS has included a spare M.2 slot, which is PCIe Gen 3 operating over 2 lanes, so you won't get the full speed from an NVMe SSD, but it is an easy way to upgrade the storage. Now, as for the memory, ASUS has done something a little bit interesting here in the fact that there is one SODIMM slot accessible. So remember, there's 16GB of memory for the system as a whole, only one SODIMM slot accessible, which has an 8GB stick. So 8GB of memory is actually soldered onto the motherboard. For me, this isn't ideal. It would be a lot easier if we just had two SODIMM slots, so it would be easy access and an easy upgrade, but I guess ASUS is trying to keep costs as low as possible. You could, if you wanted, I suppose, chuck in a 16GB stick and upgrade the memory to 24 gigs, but I think for most gamers 16GB is going to be enough. Lastly, we can also get a look at the cooling. So there's two heat pipes for both the CPU and GPU, while there is a third heat pipe for the VRM, and obviously two small fans as well. So that's been it for our look at the design. Now we're going to talk about the laptop's performance. So just to recap, the core components are the Ryzen 7 3750H, which is a 4-core 8-thread mobile processor, as well as NVIDIA's GTX 1660 Ti Max-Q, which is a rated boost clock of 1335 MHz. For all of our testing, we used the balance profile within Armoury Crate. This is how the laptop chips by default once it is plugged into power. So starting with that processor, this is, I think it's been a long time basically since I have seen a laptop with an AMD CPU, so I was really interested to see how it would get on. Well, it turns out, looking at both our Cinebench scores and also our 3D Mark Firestrike scores, that the 3750H is essentially on par, if not slightly faster, than Intel's older quad-core i7 7700HQ. That in turn should mean we are seeing similar performance to the latest gen quad core from Intel, which is the i5 9400H, although I've not tested one of those so I couldn't say for certain, but certainly looking at the figures online we are seeing very comparable performance between this AMD CPU and that latest Intel CPU. Obviously, if we compare this AMD CPU to some of Intel's 6 or 8 core processors, like the i7 8750H or even the 9880H, then we're obviously not going to see that it come that close as it doesn't have as many cores, but still, taken as a whole, for a mobile quad-core unit, I think this AMD chip actually performs really well. On top of that, we can follow this up with our games testing. So remember, it's a GTX 1660 Ti Max Q, but looking at our testing of our 5 AAA titles, we can see that frame rates was typically around the 60 FPS mark, and this was using either very high or ultra settings. In fact, the lowest average frame rate we saw was from Deus Ex Mankind Divided, which posted average FPS of just 54, which is still actually really good considering Deus Ex is a particularly demanding benchmark. Obviously, the screen has a 120Hz panel, so with AAA titles, you're not going to really get the most out of it there. But if you're playing some kind of esports title, CSGO, Apex Legends, whatever it might be, you're obviously going to see frame rates a lot higher. In fact, over the weekend, I was actually playing through Doom 2016 on this machine, kind of just to get ready for Doom Eternal when that comes out later this year. And on ultra settings, I was actually seeing frame rates of around the 90 FPS mark. So well above 60, you're getting a lot of a smoother gaming experience. And with the 120Hz panel, that gave actually overall a very good gaming experience. So overall gaming performance is certainly strong considering the AMD quad-core as well as the 1660 Ti Max-Q CPU, but how well does the laptop cool those components? Well, if we start with the CPU, firstly it idled relatively cool around 36°C, so no problems there. And actually under load, the hottest temperature we saw was 87 degrees, and that was when stressing the CPU in IDA 64. In games, we saw the temperature around 2 degrees less than that, but then the clock speed was also higher. So we tested in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and eventually after 10 minutes, the CPU had settled down at around 3.75 GHz. And when it had been stressed in IDA 64, the all cores dropped to slightly slower at 3.6 GHz. So considering that the rated boost clock is 4 GHz, you'd only ever get that on a single core anyway. An all core speed of 3.75 GHz when gaming, I think, is a great result. As for the GPU now, this ran a fair bit cooler actually. We saw a peak of 76°C, and that was again when playing Shadow of the Tomb Raider or running the 3D Mark Firestrike stress test for 20 runs. When gaming, we saw our kind of GPU frequencies typically around the 1400 MHz mark. You know, GPU boost behavior, there's always going to be some fluctuation, so it was bouncing around from maybe 380 up to probably about 450 was the highest we saw, but typically around the 400 MHz mark, which is still above the rated boost clock. So clearly we had no issues with thermal throttling or anything like that. The CPU temperature maybe is a little bit warmer than I like, but it's still below 90°C and again running at a good frequency. So overall, I think cooling performance is just fine. This cooling performance does come at the cost of noise levels, however, and bearing in mind this was all done with the balanced profile, if we put our sound meter 1 foot away from the display of the Zephyrus G, we were seeing noise levels of around 53 decibels when gaming. So that is definitely quite noticeable. You're really going to hear it sat in front of the machine, and even people in the room are going to hear it as well. So definitely one to wear a headset with when gaming. Lastly, we're just going to touch on battery life now, and I have to say actually the Zephyrus G really surprised me here. We saw total battery life within our PC Mark 8 benchmark. We saw a score of 4 hours and a half. This was in the silent profile, bear in mind, but it's actually interesting that as soon as you unplug the laptop from power, it automatically switches to the silent profile, and that also runs the CPU at slower clocks. So that's clearly just to extend the battery life. I think it's a smart decision, and bear in mind we saw 4.5 hours in the PC Mark 8 benchmark. You can effectively double that to give you a real world kind of battery life level. So if you're taking this out and about, you'd have no issues kind of just doing emailing, web browsing, that kind of thing. As soon as you start doing more intensive things, you are going to see the battery life drain faster. In fact, we ran a second test with the laptop set to the balance profile, and we got a battery life score of 2.5 hours. So that's a fairly dramatic drop from the silent profile to the balance profile, which goes to show kind of how ASUS is dealing with the power management. But like I said, if you're just doing light tasks, the silent profile is more than fast enough, and overall that gives you excellent battery life. So then, wrapping up this review, I think it's fair to say, after a lot of hype about the Zephyrus G, for me personally, I think it has massively delivered in some areas and is also under-delivered in others. The biggest selling point is undoubtedly going to be kind of the thin and light premium Zephyrus styling, despite the fact this machine costs just £1,249, and on top of that you get very decent performance as well. The biggest drawback though, like we said, is that screen where the colours just don't look that vibrant. It's slightly dull looking, so overall it's just not the most pleasing to use. This will be especially noticeable if you come from something which maybe has a much more vibrant IPS or even OLED display. How big an issue this is does depend. I think if you're just a gamer, it's not the end of the world, because you can kind of, once you get into your game, you kind of get a bit more immersed. But like I said, if you're doing more color sensitive things, or you just want something to give a really good experience for watching movies or something like that, it may not be the best. So for the next model, I'd really want ASUS to focus on just making the screen better, kind of giving it a bit more pop and vibrancy. As an overall package though, I do think it is still worth buying, just really because it's doing something that not really many other laptops are doing, in the fact that it is at the more affordable end of the spectrum, but you still get that premium look, and it's still thin and light, very portable, and like we already mentioned, you get very decent 1080p gaming performance. So for me, while there are improvements to be made, with the main one being that display, overall the ASUS ROG Zephyrus G GA502 is still worth buying. So I'm Dominic for Kit Guru. This has been my review of the Zephyrus G. If you like this, give us a thumbs up. Also leave a comment below. Let me know what you think. How big a drawback is the fact that the screen isn't that great? Will you still buy it if you're just going to play games anyway? Do let me know down below. You can also hit subscribe if you haven't already, and ping that notification bell. If you'd be interested in seeing some of our videos early, you can consider backing us on Patreon. And if you like this t-shirt I've been modelling today, you can also check out our merch using the link below. But I'm Dominic for Kit Guru. This is the Zephyrus G. I'll see you in the next video.